Come closer. The shadows have missed you, and tonight they have a new story to tell. Welcome to Scary Stories After Dark.
I don't know how to explain that night without it sounding like something invented to make fear feel interesting. Nothing dramatic led into it. No warning. No feeling that we were standing at the edge of anything. We were just together, laughing, talking over each other, pretending the world outside the walls was small enough to ignore. And then we opened something that had been waiting longer than we had been alive. The strange part isn't what we saw. It's what we almost let inside. If you listen closely, you might think this is just a story someone survived long enough to tell. But stories end. That night didn't.
The front room felt too small for 8 people and all their noise. Laughter skimmed the ceiling, bounced off framed photos, spilled into the hallway like it belonged there. The blinds were half tilted, cutting the streetlight into pale stripes across the rug. Normal, warm, safe in the way a house is safe when the night is still ordinary. Saga stood near the kitchen threshold with a cup sweating in her hand, watching her friends move like familiar weather. Desi talking with her hands, Lazarus folding himself into the corner of the couch as if he didn't want to take up space, Corvus hovering near the windows like he didn't trust glass to do its job. She told herself she was relaxed. But something kept snagging at her attention, tiny gaps in the room where sound should have lived. A laugh that ended too abruptly, a pause between words that felt held. When the knock came, it wasn't at the door. It was the front window, a soft tap against the glass. Saga turned before anyone else did. Nothing was there. Just her own faint reflection, washed in streetlight and indoor glow. She blinked hard, annoyed at herself, and the room snapped back into motion. Then Mordecai arrived. He didn't come in laughing like usual. He came in with his shoulders slightly raised, like he'd walked the last few blocks under something watching him. The cold followed him inside. Thin, sharp air that slid across the floorboards and made the hairs on Saga's arms lift. "Okay," Mordecai said, and his voice sounded too careful. "Don't freak out." Of course, that made everyone look. He held a book wrapped in an old red scarf like it might bite. He set it on the coffee table as if placing a heavy stone. The scarf shifted. The cover was dark, worn like it had been handled for years, but the red, no, not red, deeper than that, seemed to drink the light around it. A skull protruded from the surface, not carved, not painted, raised, real in the way bones are real. A small lock sat beneath it like a sealed mouth. Desi made a sound that tried to be a joke and failed halfway. "You didn't steal that, did you?" "I found it," Mordecai said, "on a park bench, just sitting there." Saga didn't move. She couldn't explain why she didn't move. Something in her chest tightened, a quiet instinct whispering, "Leave it alone." So soft it almost sounded like her own thought. Vesperina leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "That's not a language," she murmured, tracing the symbols without touching them. "It's older than language." Corvus straightened. Put it outside. But curiosity moved faster than caution. Mordecai's fingers found the lock. The click when it broke wasn't loud. It was final. The air changed so quickly it felt like the room inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Cold flooded the space, crawling under skin. The lights above them flickered once, twice, and then steadied as if pretending nothing happened. Outside, the street went silent. Saga looked at the blinds. The pale stripes of light were gone. In their place was a slow, rising crimson glow, thick as a bruise, spilling across the floor. And when Saga lifted her eyes toward the glass, she realized the moon wasn't white anymore. It was turning red. The red light didn't arrive all at once. It seeped. Slow, creeping color spilling through the blinds like something bleeding into water. It stretched across the rug, climbed the legs of the coffee table, painted their faces in a hue that made everyone look slightly unfamiliar to each other. Saga couldn't stop staring at it. The room felt colder, but not in the way winter feels cold. This was the kind of chill that didn't touch skin first. It settled deeper behind the ribs, like the body recognizing something the mind refused to name. No one spoke. Even Desi, who usually filled silence with nervous humor, just watched the window like it might explain itself if she waited long enough. Mordecai slowly withdrew his hand from the broken lock. The book lay open on the table, its pages darker than paper should be, symbols shifting in a way that made it impossible to focus on any single shape for long. "I think we should close it," Eric said quietly. Saga didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could move. The knock shattered the stillness. 3 sharp raps against the front door. Everyone flinched, a ripple of motion moving through the room like a shared reflex. Then relief followed just as quickly, fragile but desperate. "The pizza," Desi breathed, almost laughing at herself. "It's just the pizza." The explanation felt thin, but it was normal, and normal was something they clung to without discussing it. "I'll get it," Acanthus said, already standing, because standing felt easier than sitting with the wrongness. Saga watched her walk toward the door, watched the red light slide across the hallway walls as if following her. Something inside Saga stirred, not fear exactly, more like resistance, a quiet instinct tugging at the back of her mind. "Don't." The thought didn't feel like hers. Acantha reached the door. Her hand hovered over the knob for half a second too long. Then she opened it. The scream didn't sound human at first. It was cut short, dragged sideways into something raw and tearing. The group moved as one, chairs scraping, feet stumbling, rushing toward the sound without thinking. The doorway was open. Cold air poured inside, thick and metallic. Acantha was halfway across the threshold, her body being pulled forward by something they couldn't fully see. Her fingers clawed against the frame, nails bending backward, desperate to hold on to the only solid thing left. Saga grabbed her wrist. For one impossible second, there was resistance. Then the darkness outside pulled harder. Acantha vanished. The red night swallowed her so completely it felt like she had never been standing there at all. No, Lazarus lunged forward. Corvus caught his arm too late. Lazarus stepped off the porch. He disappeared before his foot hit the first step. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. Saga stood frozen in the doorway, staring into a yard that looked unchanged. Fence, grass, empty street, except for the color. The world outside wasn't dark. It was red. And far down the block, something moved across the street without making a sound. Behind her, the lights flickered. When Saga turned back toward the living room, the book was glowing. No one closed the door. It stayed open behind Saga like the house had forgotten how boundaries worked. Cold air drifted across the floorboards, carrying a scent that didn't belong to night. Metallic, damp, like rain that had fallen somewhere far away and never reached the ground. Eric was the one who finally moved. His hand trembled as he pushed the door shut, the latch clicking into place with a sound far too small to feel protective. The silence inside the house was enormous. Desi began shaking first. Not loudly, just a quiet trembling that made the glass in her hand clink against itself. Mordecai stood motionless near the hallway, staring at the empty doorway as if replaying the moment in loops his mind couldn't escape. They were right there, Lazarus whispered, voice already breaking on words that hadn't fully formed. They were right there. No one answered. Saga stepped backward into the living room, unable to stop looking at the windows. The red light pressed through the blinds now, thicker than before, turning the room into something unfamiliar. A space that resembled their gathering, but felt staged, like a memory rather than reality. The first knock at the window was soft, not urgent, not violent. Just a gentle tap, like someone trying not to startle them. Everyone turned at once. A figure stood in the yard, too far from the porch, too still. Lazarus moved before anyone could stop him, relief colliding with disbelief so quickly it hurt to watch. "Acantha," he breathed, stepping toward the glass. The shape didn't respond. It stood with its head slightly tilted, posture almost correct, but not quite, like someone imitating what standing should look like without understanding comfort. Saga's stomach dropped. Acantha didn't blink. The realization crawled through the room slowly, each person reaching it at a different moment, the horror arriving not in a scream but in quiet recognition. Her mouth moved. No sound reached the glass. Another shape appeared beside her. Lazarus staggered backward, breath collapsing into a sound Saga had never heard from him before. The second figure was him. Not perfectly, close enough to wound. Corvus swore under his breath, pulling the curtains halfway closed, but the movement outside didn't retreat. If anything, more shapes gathered at the edges of the yard, silhouettes that felt familiar without becoming identifiable. Someone laughed outside, not loudly, just wrong. The shadows came next. They crossed the windows in slow sweeps, far larger than anything standing in the yard. Branches didn't move. The fence didn't shift. Only the shadows passed. Tall, stretching shapes sliding across the glass as if the house were being circled by something too large to reveal itself. Desi covered her ears. "We shouldn't have opened it," she whispered, the words spilling out like confession. Saga couldn't pull her eyes away from the window, because Acantha was still there, still watching, still waiting. And when Saga met her gaze, Acantha smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, just wide enough to reveal teeth that didn't belong to anyone Saga loved. Behind them, the book's pages turned on their own. The knocking started softly, not at the windows this time, at the door. 3 uneven hits, wood against knuckles that sounded tired rather than threatening. The sound threaded through the house and settled in the space where Acantha's screams still lingered, twisting everyone's nerves tighter instead of pulling them toward relief. No one moved. Saga felt the hesitation ripple through the room like shared breath held too long. The shapes outside the windows hadn't left. They remained scattered across the yard, patient in a way that felt deliberate, as if time belonged more to them than it did to anyone inside the house. The knock came again, weaker.
"Please."
A voice rasped through the wood.
"Please. I don't know what's happening out here."
Desi covered her mouth. Corvus shook his head immediately, already backing away from the door as if proximity alone was risk. "It's bait," he whispered. But the voice outside cracked in a way that didn't sound rehearsed. There was confusion in it, panic. The raw, messy edge of someone who hadn't had time to become anything but afraid. Saga's gaze drifted toward the windows. The figures outside hadn't moved closer. They were watching the door. That felt worse. Acantha would have opened it. The realization arrived quietly and hurt more than the memory of the scream.
"I'm going to die out here."
The voice said, softer now.
"I can hear them walking."
The sound of footsteps passed beyond the porch, slow, dragging movement against gravel that didn't belong to any single direction. Something circled the house, just out of view, just out of understanding. Acantha would have opened it. Saga felt that thought settle into her chest like weight. Acantha wasn't here anymore. Someone had to decide.
"I'll do it,"
Acantha's voice said. Saga blinked. The room froze. Because the voice hadn't come from outside. It came from beside her. Saga turned slowly. Acantha stood near the hallway entrance, shoulders relaxed, expression gentle. The way she always looked when trying to reassure everyone else before herself. Saga's breath stopped. The others stared, unable to process the impossible duplication. The memory of Acantha being dragged into the red night, colliding violently with the quiet presence standing inside the house now. Acantha smiled. Not wide. Just enough. "Don't," Vesperina whispered, the words slicing through the moment like glass. The knock returned, desperate now, frantic.
"Please."
Saga's gaze snapped back to the door. The person outside began to sob, the sound collapsing into itself in a way that felt too uncontrolled to be mimicry. Acantha inside the house didn't move toward the door. She only watched Saga. waiting. Saga's chest tightened, that strange internal pull returning. The sense of being observed not by eyes, but by something deeper, something listening through her instead of around her. Acantha would have opened it. Saga stepped forward. Corvus grabbed her arm. "If you open that—" "I know," Saga whispered. She didn't know, but she couldn't stand there listening to someone beg while the house decided for them. Saga reached the handle. The cold against her palm felt wrong, like touching metal that had been left outside too long. She opened the door. The figure stumbled inside before she could second-guess herself, collapsing against the wall in shaking breaths. Blood streaked his sleeve, his uniform damp with sweat and dirt, eyes wide with the kind of fear that hadn't found words yet.
I thought I was the only one.
He gasped. Saga closed the door behind him. The house felt smaller now, more crowded. Because when she turned back toward the hallway, Acantha was gone. The man lifted his head, voice trembling.
"My name's Silas,"
he said.
"I think something followed me here."
Behind them, the book's pages turned again. Silas didn't stop shaking. He tried to hide it, folding his hands together, pressing his back against the wall, as if stillness might make him smaller. But the tremor never fully left him. His eyes moved constantly, tracking windows, corners, the ceiling, like he expected something to peel itself loose from the shadows if he looked away too long. No one blamed him. Saga barely remembered what calm felt like either. The house had settled into a fragile quiet after Silas entered, the kind that felt less like peace and more like waiting. Outside, the shapes in the yard had thinned, drifting farther from the porch, but the absence didn't feel like safety. It felt like the night had stepped back to watch from a better distance. The sound of paper broke the stillness. Mordecai hadn't touched the book, but its pages shifted anyway. A slow rustling that made everyone's breath catch in unison. One sheet loosened itself, sliding free as if pushed by an invisible hand. It didn't fall to the floor. It moved, gliding across the hardwood toward the back hallway, stopping only when it reached the glass door leading to the yard. Corvus swore under his breath. "No, absolutely not." Saga approached carefully, every step feeling louder than it should. Beyond the glass, the backyard looked unchanged. Fence line, picnic table, the shadow of the old oak stretching across the grass. Except something sat on the table. A folded piece of paper that hadn't been there earlier. Silas leaned closer to the glass, voice barely audible. "That wasn't there when I ran past." The red light outside felt different here. Dimmer but thicker, like fog instead of glow. The yard didn't look hostile. It looked patient. "We don't know who put it there," Corvus said, "or what it wants." Vesperina tilted her head, studying the distance between the door and the table as if measuring something deeper than space. "It wants to be found." That felt worse. Silas swallowed hard. "I can get it." Saga looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, and his honesty made the room quieter. But I was already out there once. I know how it feels. No one argued. Saga opened the door. The cold outside wrapped around her immediately, heavier than before, pressing against her lungs with a density that made each breath feel slightly borrowed. The grass muffled their footsteps, swallowing sound instead of reflecting it. The walk to the picnic table felt too long. Shadows gathered along the fence line without forming shapes, movement visible without bodies to hold it. The oak tree's branches shifted though there was no wind, leaves whispering in a language Saga almost understood. Silas reached the table first. The paper trembled beneath his fingers despite the still air. Nothing attacked. Nothing chased. The quiet was unbearable. He unfolded the note. His expression didn't change immediately, which somehow felt worse than panic. He handed it to Saga, eyes wide, not with fear, but recognition of something he didn't want to understand. Saga read the uneven handwriting. It doesn't want to be opened. It wants to be held. Do not trust the ones who return. The house is safer than the night, but only if the book stays inside. Saga's breath caught. A sound echoed from behind them. Not from the yard, from inside the house. A slow knock. Against the back door. The knock from inside the house didn't repeat. That made it worse. Saga stood frozen, halfway between the picnic table and the back door, the note trembling faintly in her hand while the silence stretched into something dense and listening. The red light pooled around the edges of the yard, pressing closer as if curious about their hesitation. Silas swallowed hard. That came from inside. Saga nodded before she realized she was doing it. The back door stood closed, glass reflecting their silhouettes back at them, warped slightly by the red glow. Nothing waited behind it. No movement, no shapes. Just the quiet suggestion that something had already entered. Saga reached for the handle. The metal was warm now. That felt wrong enough to make her hesitate. They stepped back into the house together. The air had shifted again. Not colder, not heavier, just incorrect. The living room felt farther away than it should have been, the hallway stretching in a way that didn't match the floor plan Saga knew by heart. The shadows inside weren't red anymore. They were darker than the light itself. "Eric," Saga called softly. No answer. Her voice didn't echo. It felt swallowed before it traveled. Silas stayed close behind her, the instinct to remain near another living person stronger than pride. The floorboards creaked under their steps with a delay, sound arriving half a second after movement, as if time inside the house had begun drifting out of alignment. The living room finally came into view. Mordecai stood beside the coffee table. He hadn't moved since they left, but the book had. It was no longer open on the table. It rested against Saga's chair, angled toward the hallway as though repositioned to face her absence. Mordecai's gaze lifted slowly. "I didn't touch it." Saga believed him. The pages moved anyway. A soft, restless shifting that sounded less like paper and more like breath. Symbols slid across the surface in slow rearrangements, never settling into anything readable yet impossible to look away from. Saga felt the pull then. Not emotional, not curious. Something deeper. A quiet recognition humming under her skin, like hearing a distant melody you somehow already know the ending to. Her chest tightened, breath growing shallow as the distance between her and the book felt charged with invisible gravity. Silas noticed first. "Saga," he said gently. She didn't answer. Her fingers lifted without permission, reaching toward the book with the hesitant certainty of someone remembering a gesture rather than choosing it. The closer she stepped, the quieter the room became, as if sound itself retreated to give the moment space. The book opened, no hands touching it. Saga's reflection appeared in the dark surface of the page, but the expression staring back wasn't quite hers. Her posture remained still, but inside the reflection, her mouth moved slightly, forming words that never reached the air. Behind her, Vesperina inhaled sharply. "She can hear it." Saga felt the whisper then. Not words. An awareness. A sense of something older than intention brushing against her thoughts, not invading, not demanding, simply existing close enough to be noticed. The feeling wasn't violent. It was patient. Silas stepped forward, voice steady despite the fear threading through it. "Saga, look at me." Her reflection didn't turn, but Saga did. The connection loosened for a second, just enough for confusion to rush back into her expression like breath after being held underwater. The hallway light flickered. A door down the corridor opened slowly on its own, and from the dark beyond, it came the soft sound of someone whispering Saga's name in a voice that belonged to her. The whisper coming from the hallway wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Saga's name drifted through the darkness with the soft certainty of someone calling her home. Familiar, patient, impossibly gentle. The voice didn't echo through the house. It felt like it originated inside the walls themselves, vibrating just beneath the surface of everything. Saga felt it in her chest before she heard it. A pull without urgency, a belonging without comfort. Her body moved before thought caught up, steps carrying her toward the hallway in the slow, dreamlike rhythm of someone walking through water. The air felt warmer the farther she went, the darkness ahead not threatening but inviting. A quiet absence of resistance. "Saga," Silas said behind her, voice cracking in a way that made the moment fragile. She didn't stop. The hallway stretched unnaturally, the door at its end farther away with each step instead of closer. The whisper continued, fragments of sound that resembled memory more than language, the suggestion of laughter, familiar voices, the soft reassurance of people she loved and had already lost. The house wasn't trapping her. It was offering her somewhere to rest. Vesperina reached for Mordecai's arm. If she crosses that threshold, "She won't," Silas said. He didn't sound certain, but he stepped forward anyway. Saga reached the doorway. The darkness inside wasn't empty. It moved like deep water, slow, heavy currents shifting without surface disturbance. Shapes formed briefly at the edges of her vision. Acantha smiling gently, Lazarus reaching out, figures that felt safe enough to step toward without hesitation. The book opened wider behind her. Saga's reflection inside its pages no longer mirrored her movements. The reflection had already stepped forward, already surrendered the distance Saga still hesitated to cross. Silas grabbed her wrist. The contact jolted through her like static. "Saga," he whispered closer now, steadier despite the tremor in his hand. "This isn't them." Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness. "They're not hurting there." Silas swallowed hard. "Neither are you. You're just here." The whispering intensified. Not louder, but layered, the illusion of warmth pressing harder against the quiet loneliness that had begun to bloom inside Saga's chest. The promise of reunion felt soft and inevitable, like something she had been moving toward long before tonight. Silas stepped in front of her, breaking the view. The hallway light flickered violently, the darkness behind him recoiling slightly as if interrupted rather than threatened. "You don't belong to it," he said, voice shaking but unwavering. "You belong to the people who are still standing next to you." Saga blinked. The illusion fractured, not disappearing, just losing its certainty. Confusion rushed back in waves, grief following close behind, the emotional weight of what she almost accepted settling heavily into her chest. Behind them, Corvus slammed the book shut. The sound felt like air rushing back into a sealed room. The whispering stopped. The red light outside the windows thinned slowly, bleeding back toward something closer to night instead of wound. The shapes in the yard dissolved without retreat, simply becoming absent in a way that suggested they were never meant to stay. Saga collapsed forward. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. The house exhaled. And when Saga lifted her head, the book was gone. Morning didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with the absence of red. The color that had pressed against every surface of the house simply thinned, retreating into something less defined until the windows reflected a sky that looked ordinary enough to distrust. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was exhaustion given shape. Saga sat on the floor where Silas had lowered her, hands resting loosely in her lap, as if unsure what to do with themselves now that the pull had gone quiet. The house felt smaller again, familiar in ways that almost hurt. Furniture back in its place, shadows behaving like shadows instead of intentions. No one spoke at first. Desi stared at the windows as though expecting the figures to return if she blinked too long. Corvus paced slowly along the walls, checking doors without admitting that was what he was doing. Mordecai stood near the empty space where the book had last rested, expression caught between curiosity and something closer to guilt. Saga felt different in ways she couldn't explain without sounding untrustworthy. The memory of the whisper lingered. Not words, just the warmth of being almost convinced to step somewhere she could never return from. The grief of that realization settled quietly behind her ribs, not sharp enough to break her, but too heavy to ignore. Silas sat across from her, not watching, just staying. The front door opened cautiously an hour later, the world outside revealing itself in slow fragments. Quiet street, unmoving trees, the ordinary cruelty of normalcy continuing as if nothing had nearly crossed into it. No neighbors screaming, no evidence of absence. Just morning pretending it had always been there. They left the house together without ceremony, each step carrying the shared understanding that explanation would never come. Whatever the book had been, wherever it had come from, the night had not behaved like something meant to be understood. It had simply happened. Silas lingered at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the house the way one watches a place that holds a memory too heavy to revisit but impossible to forget. He didn't speak until later. Not to them, just to the quiet. "We thought surviving meant it was over," Silas whispered, voice worn but steady. "But some things don't end. They just move somewhere else and wait for hands that don't know better." Days passed before he saw it. A small pop-up bookstall on a quiet street corner. Paperbacks stacked unevenly, the soft comfort of strangers browsing titles meant to be forgotten as easily as they were purchased. He wouldn't have noticed. Except for the color. A book resting near the edge of the table, its cover drinking the afternoon light instead of reflecting it. The skull on its surface looked no older, no heavier, no more significant than any other forgotten thing waiting to be chosen. Sigillum sanguinis. A passerby picked it up casually, curiosity blooming in the same harmless way Mordecai's had. Silas didn't move. He understood something now that felt too large to warn anyone about. The night hadn't ended. It had only changed hands.
I still think about that night when the world gets too quiet. Not the screaming, not the things standing outside the windows pretending to be loved. The quiet after, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to explain itself. We survived. That's the part people expect to feel like victory. But survival doesn't sound the way stories make it sound. It sounds like friends sitting in the same room days later, speaking softly around something none of us can name, without making it real again. Saga doesn't look at doors the same way anymore. None of us do. Sometimes I catch myself listening for knocking that isn't there. Sometimes I think I hear it anyway. I believe the book was evil. It chose us, and we were just close enough to open it. And when it was finished with us, it didn't leave behind anger or warning. Just absence, like a storm that never belonged to the sky in the first place. I saw it again today. Not where something like that should exist. Not hidden, not guarded. Just waiting among ordinary things. Patient in the way only something that has always existed can afford to be. I thought about stopping them, about telling someone what happens when curiosity touches the wrong silence. But some nights aren't meant to be prevented, only remembered. If you ever feel the air change without reason, if the quiet feels like it's listening back, leave the lock untouched. Some stories don't begin when you open the book. They begin when the book realizes you're there.